I'm Iris Tao in for Steve Lance. World leaders expressed low expectations for the first peace talks between Russia and Ukraine since the war began. That says neither the Russian nor Ukrainian president will be attending. But President Trump says he might still stop by if it'll help. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has more on the talks in Turkey.
As the first meeting between Russia and Ukraine since the start of the war begins, expectations are low. Russian President Vladimir Putin not attending, sending an aide instead to lead the Russian delegation. World leaders calling this delegation low level. Zelensky was already in Turkey's capital of Istanbul to meet with Turkish President Erdogan on Thursday and potentially meet Putin. But he sent his foreign minister to the Russia talks instead. President Trump said that he wasn't expecting Putin to attend if he wasn't there himself.
And I said, I don't think he's going to go if I don't go, and that turned out to be right.
And that he may still go to Turkey for peace talks if he finds it helpful. That's as he's finishing up his trip to the Middle East with his last scheduled stop in the UAE.
Look, nothing's going to happen until Putin and I get together, okay?
Secretary of State Marco Rubio is facilitating these talks between Russian and Ukrainian leaders. Rubio said that these talks were initiated by Russia in the first place and that the U.S. came because they were told that there might be direct talks between top officials of Russia and Ukraine. But after seeing the negotiating team that Russia sent, Rubio said that these talks won't bear any fruit.
We don't have high expectations of what will happen tomorrow. The level of team that was sent by the Russian side is certainly not indicative of one that's going to lead to a major breakthrough.
That's as just outside of Turkey's capital, NATO foreign ministers Thursday meeting informally to debate whether to meet the U.S. demands of raising defense spending. 22 of the 32 member countries are meeting their initial aim of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. But the U.S. wants them all to reach 5%, saying that it'll make the alliance more self-sustaining rather than relying on funds mostly from the U.S. And at the meeting, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte also raised the threat of terrorism, Russia, and the Chinese Communist Party.
China is rapidly building up its armed forces, which is, of course, a big concern. They will have 1,000 nuclear warheads by the end of the decade.
The top leaders of NATO member countries, including Trump and his counterparts, are meeting in the Netherlands in June. Reporting by Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Billions in new investments from the United Arab Emirates. And that's as the UAE also agrees to further agreement to align itself more with the US when it comes to AI developments. Here's more. Receiving a grand welcome in Abu Dhabi.
We've become a very hot country.
President Trump announces over $200 billion in commercial deals between the U.S. and UAE, bringing the total investments from the Gulf region to over $2 trillion, all announced during the president's three-country visit this week.
And that's your biggest investment that you've ever made, and we really appreciate it, and we're going to treat you very, as you should be, magnificently.
The U.S. and UAE on Thursday also signed an AI agreement supporting the $1.4 trillion investment commitment the administration secured back in March. According to the White House, that includes the UAE investing in U.S. data centers and further aligning their national security regulations with the U.S., including, quote, strong protections to prevent the diversion of U.S. origin technology.
AI plus, it's a massive project.
The AI agreement comes as President Trump pushes for deals to sell advanced U.S. chips to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have been trying to become leading AI powers. But the region's deep ties to China had made the Biden administration cautious about the risk of China getting U.S. chips through the region to use for its own military. That resulted in U.S. restrictions on chip exports to the Middle East. Now, the Trump White House says it got countries like the UAE to promise that they'll prevent U.S. technologies from being diverted to China. But Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer warns that such promises need more scrutiny.
We have no clarity on how the Saudis and Emiratis will prevent the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, the Chinese manufacturing establishment from getting their hands on these chips. That's why we've had such strong restrictions against exporting these chips.
Meanwhile, despite the administration's push, it remains to be seen, though, if China hawks in Washington would actually greenlight AI chip shipments to the Gulf region, as that does require a licensing process involving several agencies. Reporting by Iris Tao, NTD News. At the Supreme Court today, several justices appear skeptical about the Trump administration's request to limit district courts' nationwide injunctions. Some say that if you limit the injunctions, people who don't file claims won't benefit from the rulings. Here are some highlights from today's arguments.
Supreme Court justices peppered the Justice Department with questions on Thursday over its request to limit nationwide injunctions. Lower courts in 3 districts blocked the Trump administration from enforcing its executive order on birthright citizenship. The order limits birthright citizenship to children born to legal permanent residents and immigrants with legal status. Justice Elena Kagan questioned the government on what would be the quickest remedy going forward if nationwide injunctions were not allowed.
Let's just assume you're dead wrong. How do we get to that result? Does every single person that is affected by this EO have to bring their own suit? Are there alternatives? How long does it take? How do we get to the result that there is a single rule of citizenship that is the rule that we've historically applied rather than the rule that the EO would have us do?
Solicitor General John Sauer suggested that plaintiffs could file a class action lawsuit, which led to this back and forth with Kagan.
Rule 23 would be one natural path, assuming that a class could be certified, which we might dispute in this particular case.
Well, you might dispute it, and I think the question is there a class that's just all children of people who have entered illegally? Is that an appropriate class? Can the same thing be done under Rule 23? Or are you going to tell me that, no, Rule 23 has lots of requirements, and you'll never be able to certify a class like that?
Rule 23 provides the equitable tools subject to rigorous criteria, appropriately rigorous criteria, to obtain that kind of class-wide.
One of the biggest concerns for Justices Kagan and Amy Coney Barrett was that affected individuals who didn't file claims could have to wait years before getting any relief. Chief Justice John Roberts reminded them that the court has made quick decisions in the past.
3 years, 4 years, we've been able to move much more expeditiously. I think we did the TikTok case in a month.
Some justices mix the merits of the underlying case with the question before the court, which is about nationwide injunctions.
The president is violating not just one, but by my count, 4 established Supreme Court precedents. So as far as I see it, this order violates 4 Supreme Court precedents.
Yeah,
and you are claiming that not just the Supreme Court, that both the Supreme Court and no lower court can stop an executive from universally from violating those holdings by this court.
Other justices expressed concern about how the states would carry out the law going forward if they ruled in the government's favor. Plaintiffs argued that there would be chaos if nationwide injunctions were not allowed. The Supreme Court will make its decision before its term ends in June.
Now for more on the Supreme Court, here to discuss the legal implications of the birthright citizenship case is former Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill. Curtis, great to have you on the program with us.
Thank you for having me.
So the Supreme Court today weighing President Trump's order to end citizenship by birth for children of illegal immigrants. From a legal perspective first, what's the reasoning behind this, and what are the judges here really considering?
Well, you're talking about a provision that comes from the Civil War era itself, a provision that provided for the former black slaves to be given citizenship based upon birth. It wasn't intended to be an immigration issue, certainly not as it's applied today. So the issues become, if you look at the language in the actual provision, are these individuals subject to the jurisdiction of the court? And the position that would support the executive orders would say absolutely not. That these are children who are born here to illegal parents who had no jurisdiction to the court, so therefore they don't belong in this country. I think it's a very strong argument, but on the other side, you have those who would suggest that there's been 150 years of precedent that would suggest otherwise.
And now it also appears that even if the court does end up blocking the birthright citizenship order, they may still limit the ability of the judges to curtail the president. Judges have issued over 40 national injunctions since President Trump began his second term. Explain for us here how this works and what it would mean if SCOTUS actually rules on this.
Well, that seems to be the biggest question in this particular ruling today, is what to do about the nationwide injunctions. And it's a very serious problem. It's a constitutional crisis. To allow one federal district judge to have that much power really tilts the balance of the balance of government. So it's imperative that the Supreme Court come down on limiting the scope of a one or a single federal district judge. We're seeing it in cases where one action is stopping the executive authority of the president in its tracks, and then we're getting mixed signals from one district court to another district court. So this is a very important time for the court to take action, limiting the lower courts so that we can have a fair and equitable balance between our federal government partners.
And meanwhile, in another high-profile case today, a Wisconsin judge, Hannah Dugan, pleaded not guilty to obstructing ICE agents. She's accused of diverting them away from a legal immigrant who was in her own courthouse and letting him out a side door. Now she's claiming a judicial immunity. First, explain to us, what is judicial immunity and how strong is her defense, in your opinion?
Well, judicial immunity is rightfully a protection to given the courts that allow for judges to have latitude in how they conduct their jobs. And typically, judges have control over their courtrooms, every aspect of what goes on. But this is outside the scope of typical judicial immunity. It's one thing for a requirement that a judge cooperate with the federal government. That's not what we're really talking about here. The allegation is that she opened up the side door and let the guy out, basically facilitated his escape from what was known to be custody. That's specifically opposing a federal agency. I don't think there's going to be immunity for that particular action.
And finally, back to the Supreme Court here. A ruling by the justices today could make it easier to accuse police of unreasonable force. And this was a unanimous decision about considering the circumstances in the case of a 2016 shooting. Why did they make this ruling, and what impact could this have?
Well, this was a case that involved what's called the moment of threat. Typically, the courts are looking at a police action shooting, and they're able to consider only the moment of threat for consideration as to what should occur and how liability should apply. This expanded action really, and I like it. I think it's very suitable for police actions, for police officers who do the right thing, to want to have all of their activities, all of the actions be scrutinized. So what it does is it expands beyond simply the moment of the threat, and allows the trier of fact to examine all of the events that happened prior to and subsequent to the actual shooting itself. I think that's a solid standard. I think that any good police officer would want the entirety of the circumstances to be reviewed, and I think the justices, by unanimous decision, agreed.
And finally, back to illegal immigration here. The justices are also considering the Trump administration's request to end humanitarian parole for over 500,000 people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. What is the status of the administration's legal battles right now over using the Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged gang members?
Well, again, because of the single district judges being able to have such power to create nationwide injunctions and such, you've got some judges that have suggested that the president doesn't have the authority. Just yesterday, we had a federal judge that said that the president did have the specific authority and laid out a framework to provide for due process in the process. So what we really need to see is the Supreme Court step up and engage into this process so that we can have this settled once and for all.
Well, very timely insights here. Former Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The mayor of Newark, New Jersey, appearing in court today. The mayor, Ras Baraka, is facing a misdemeanor charge after allegedly trespassing at a New Jersey detention center last week. His lawyers are now seeking to have the charge dismissed. The incident took place on Friday outside the Delaney Hall Immigration Detention Center. The mayor and 3 other Democratic members of Congress were protesting plans to open the 1,000-bed processing center. One of the mayor's lawyers argues that Baraka was invited to the facility and was outside it when he was handcuffed and detained. The lawyers say that they're seeking dismissal on the grounds that the Trump administration is selectively prosecuting the Democratic mayor. The defense plans to file the motions next month. And yesterday, Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem spoke on this case. She called the protest a political stunt that put the safety of federal agents at risk. 200 people reportedly attended the protest, and Nunn further accused the 3 lawmakers of shoving and striking law enforcement officers.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.